From a Karen who mistook my private land for a public park, until reality checked her, to one who dialed up racism over a simple internet request, these are tales of Karens who thought they ruled the world, only to crash land back to Earth. But first, let's talk about the one who was so sure the cops would take her side after I banned her shortcut, only to watch them shut her down instead. It all started on a typical Tuesday morning. I was sipping my coffee on the porch when I noticed a familiar figure, Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood rules, walking down the street. Her hair was tightly pulled back into a bun, and she wore a blouse that was just a bit too professional for the casual neighborhood environment. She was on her way to her usual destination, the edge of my property. I had no idea when or why she started using my land as a shortcut, but over the past few months, it had become an inconvenience. She'd saunter across my yard, sometimes with a dog in tow, other times simply cutting through, as though my property existed solely to save her a few steps. She didn't ask, didn't acknowledge it, and most of all, didn't respect the boundaries of my land. It was a quiet Tuesday when I decided to put an end to it. I had posted a sign near the boundary of my property, just a simple warning, no trespassing beyond this point. Respect private property. I didn't expect much pushback. After all, most people respected boundaries. But Karen wasn't like most people. The moment she saw the sign, her face contorted with irritation. She stopped, glared at it, then looked around as though someone might be watching her. A minute passed. Another. She started pacing in front of my yard, and I could tell she was stewing over the fact that I had dared to stop her from using my land. I had my phone in hand, watching the entire spectacle unfold. The next thing I knew, she was pulling out her own phone. A few taps, a pause, and then, in a voice loud enough for me to hear from my porch, she said, "Yes, I need to report someone. They've blocked off their land and are preventing me from using a shortcut. I don't know what their problem is, but it's harassment." I blinked. Harassment. I had simply put up a sign to stop her from walking across my yard, like it was her personal walking path. But before I could process what was happening, she was dialing 911. The operator's voice crackled through the phone. 911, what's your emergency? This is Karen Thompson from the Lakeside HOA, Karen began, her voice dripping with authority. I'm calling because my neighbor, who lives at 17 Willow Lane, has put up a barrier across his land and is denying me the right to walk through it. I use that shortcut every day, and now he's preventing me from going through. I'm being harassed and need someone to come resolve this immediately. I could barely believe what I was hearing. Karen had just called the police over a simple boundary dispute. My land wasn't hers to traverse. I didn't know whether to laugh or shake my head. I'm sorry, ma'am, but that sounds like a civil matter, the operator said. This is a police emergency line. I'll need to transfer you to the non-emergency line. No, Karen interrupted, her voice raising. This is an emergency. He's banning me from my usual path. This is harassment, and I won't stand for it. I listened in stunned silence. I had expected an argument, but this was bordering on absurdity. The conversation escalated as Karen insisted that her right to use the shortcut was being infringed upon. She seemed genuinely convinced that her actions were justified, even though no one had given her permission to cut through anyone's property in the first place. I couldn't help myself. I walked down the porch steps and approached her, my shadow casting over her as she continued to speak into the phone. "Excuse me, Karen," I called out, my voice calm but firm. She glanced up at me, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, so now you're coming outside to harass me in person?" "No," I replied, "but I am telling you that I'd appreciate it if you didn't call 911 over something like this. You're trespassing on my land. I have every right to block you from using it as a shortcut." Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. She threw her phone into her purse with a snap. "I'm reporting you to the HOA for this. You're not allowed to do this. I've been walking through here for months. Just because you've been walking through here doesn't mean you have permission," I said, trying to stay composed. "You've never asked me, and you certainly haven't respected my boundaries." Karen crossed her arms, glaring at me as though she were ready to wage war over the smallest thing. "I don't need your permission. You're just trying to be difficult because you're one of those people who doesn't like following the rules." I almost laughed. Karen was the one who didn't follow the rules, thinking she could simply do whatever she pleased because she lived in the same neighborhood. But instead of engaging, I just stood there, waiting for her next move. Seconds later, she turned and started stomping off, muttering to herself, "You'll regret this, you'll see. The HOA will hear about it." True to her word, it wasn't long before I received a letter in my mailbox. It was a formal complaint, signed by Karen herself, accusing me of harassment and property obstruction. She demanded that the HOA intervene, claiming that my actions were a violation of some nebulous neighborhood policy. I wasn't worried. I'd done nothing wrong. In fact, I had a copy of the deed for my property, which clearly outlined my rights as the homeowner. If Karen wanted to take this any further, I was ready. The HOA's response, when it came, was predictable. They stated that as long as I wasn't violating any local laws or blocking access to a public right-of-way, I was within my rights. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Karen, though, wasn't one to back down easily. Days passed, and I didn't hear from her again, at least not directly. But I had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time I'd hear from the HOA Karen. For now, my land was my own. And if Karen wanted to keep playing her games, she could do it from her own property, far away from my peaceful corner of the neighborhood. But peace never lasts long when a Karen is involved. One moment, they face consequences for their behavior, and the next, they're back at it, unchecked, emboldened, and ready to stir chaos over the pettiest of things. Imagine an HOA so absurdly petty that a simple internet request spirals into something far uglier, something that makes you wonder just how far a Karen will go. A few months after graduation, my girlfriend and I packed up and moved to a new state. She had been accepted into an engineering program, and I had finally settled into a rhythm of life where college stress was behind me. We found a beautiful garden apartment-style complex, complete with all the amenities we wanted, including blazing fast internet. Or so we thought. The property manager was strict, but well-mannered, and at first he seemed like a professional who knew what he was doing. He was a little stiff, but nothing that stood out as a red flag. That is, until we signed the lease. The first issue arose when we tried to go into his office. Initially, we had walked in without an appointment, back when we were just viewing a model apartment, and he didn't seem to mind. But when I stopped by a few weeks later to ask a simple question, he refused to talk to me. He was sitting there, casually browsing social media, and when I approached, he asked me to send an email for an appointment, no exceptions. The second issue came with a strange, seemingly innocent clause in our lease. When we received the keys to our apartment, we were asked to complete a list of discrepancies within 48 hours. We did so and emailed it in before the 48-hour mark. But the property manager came back and told us that the terms had recently changed, and the time frame was now 24 hours. He insisted that the copy of the lease we had signed was outdated, even though it clearly stated 48 hours. And worse yet, he refused to take responsibility, instead demanding we schedule an appointment to sign an updated lease. The third issue was the advertised internet speed. When we signed the lease, the ad clearly stated 100 megabits per second of internet, included in the price. What we got, however, was barely 15 megabits on a good day, and more often than not, we barely scraped 5 megabits per second. We tried to reach out about this, only to be told once again that we needed to make an appointment. Finally, we decided to schedule an appointment to address all of the issues. The property manager sat behind his desk as I explained the litany of problems we were facing. But instead of addressing them, he leaned forward and made a comment that stopped me dead in my tracks. "There are other communities in this neighborhood that may be more accepting of people like you and your girlfriend," he said, barely looking up from his desk. "You're welcome to break the lease and leave." At first, I thought he was just referring to our repeated attempts to reach him about these issues, that maybe our persistence had finally pushed him over the edge. But my girlfriend, who had been silent until then, immediately saw it for what it was. "That was a racist comment," she said quietly, her voice sharp with disbelief. "He's not talking about how we're annoying, he's talking about us." I had a feeling she was right, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. However, after reflecting on his comment, we decided to take action. I started digging. I found out that the property manager worked for a larger organization, a company that owned several apartment complexes across the country. Through LinkedIn, I connected with their director of human resources, and after a few emails, sent her everything. Our lease, copies of all emails we'd sent, photos of the internet speeds we were getting, and even screenshots of the property's advertising. I included the details of the comment the manager made, along with our concerns about the treatment we were experiencing. Within a few hours, the HR director responded, assuring us that she would look into the situation. 2 days later, we received a call from the property manager. He asked if we would come into the office to discuss things. We arrived at the end of the day, and as soon as we walked in, he seemed different. His earlier confidence had dissipated. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," he said, as if the words were foreign in his mouth. "I'm willing to credit you a month's rent for your troubles, and I'd like you to accept the damages attachment. We'll also have the ISB come by within the week to fix the internet speed." I wanted to say something, but my girlfriend cut me off. She leaned forward and said, There are other communities in this neighborhood that may be more accepting of people like you. You're welcome to leave." His face faltered for a second. He tried to backpedal, revealing just how much his job might be on the line, and asked us to reconsider. But it was too late. We declined his offer, and within the week, he was replaced with an older, sweeter woman who was as far from the previous manager's demeanor as possible. She didn't just credit us the rent, accept the damages attachment, and schedule the ISB to come by and fix the internet. She went above and beyond. She welcomed us to reach out with anything we might need, and made it clear that her door was always open. A few months later, I checked up on the old property manager. It wasn't a surprise when I saw that he was still unemployed. He had ruined his career with one comment and a series of poor decisions, and it seemed that karma had caught up with him. Meanwhile, we settled into our apartment, enjoying a far more comfortable living situation. The internet worked as promised, and the issues we had faced were put behind us. But there was one thing that stuck with me. Sometimes, people think they can get away with saying things, doing things that they believe will go unnoticed. But in the age of information, you can only hide behind your lies for so long. And for the property manager, that moment arrived far sooner than he ever expected. Just when I thought I had left Karen's antics behind, another one surfaced, this time even bolder. What started as a clash with the property manager turned out to be just the first in a series of unsettling encounters. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. In my next story, Karen took entitlement to a whole new level by trying to turn my private land into a public parking lot. But what awaited her was something she never saw coming. But before we dive into the story, we invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more voices on board and share even more unforgettable stories like this one. Now, let's get back to the mystery surrounding Karen, who decided to make my property her public park. When I bought the property at 42 Oak Lane, I had no idea what I was getting into. The house was quaint, the yard was large, and the view of the lake was serene. But there was one thing I didn't know. My land was being used as a shortcut. Before I moved in, the previous owners had left the property mostly untouched, and while they weren't around to manage it, the locals seemed to have taken it upon themselves to use the yard as a convenient pass-through. My neighbor, Karen, was no exception. She would drive down my street, park at the edge of my land, and then cut through my front yard to avoid the longer, winding road. Every day, without fail, her car would come to a screeching halt by the driveway, and she'd quickly hop out and march across my lawn like it was a public park. I didn't mind at first. It was just a small inconvenience, and I didn't want to start trouble. But as the weeks passed, I started to notice something. Karen wasn't just using it occasionally. She was using it every day, sometimes multiple times a day. She'd drive up, park, and stride through as if she had the right to do so. One afternoon, after a particularly frustrating week of her constant shortcuts, I decided I'd had enough. I placed a simple sign at the edge of my property, "Private property. No trespassing." I thought that would be the end of it, but of course Karen didn't take well to being told what to do. The very next morning, I watched from my kitchen window as Karen's car pulled up to the spot. I could already see the familiar flick of her hand as she shifted it into park. But instead of walking toward the edge of my yard, she paused, looked at the sign, and then pulled out her phone. Her eyes narrowed, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in her head. Then I heard her voice, loud and clear, even from the distance. 911, I need help. Someone's blocking off the road and I can't get through. I blinked in disbelief. Was she seriously calling the police because I posted a sign on my own property? "Ma'am, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. "I'm Karen Thompson," she began, her voice dripping with exaggerated calm. "I live on Elm Street, and I've been using this shortcut for years. Now, the new homeowner at 42 Oak Lane has decided to block it off. I'm being harassed by their unreasonable behavior. I can't get through to my own property." I could barely contain my laughter. This was absurd. She wasn't even talking about a road or public access. She was referring to my lawn, the lawn that was legally mine. I had a decision to make. Do I let this blow over, or do I confront her? I chose the latter. I walked outside just as Karen hung up her phone, still standing on the edge of my lawn, her arms crossed defiantly. She saw me coming and didn't even bother to hide her annoyance. "Are you really going to make this difficult?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I've been using this route for years. You can't just block it off like that. People have places to be and I need to get home." "Karen, this is my property. You don't have the right to cut through whenever you please," I said, trying to stay calm. "You've been doing it for years, but that doesn't give you permission to keep doing it. I've asked you before and now I've made it official." "Official?" Karen scoffed. A sign isn't official. You're harassing me by blocking my shortcut. I'll have you know I've already called the police. They'll be here any minute and you'll regret doing this. I shook my head, trying not to get caught up in the ridiculousness of the situation. Karen, you can't call 911 over something like this. I haven't done anything illegal. You've been using my yard as a shortcut for years without permission. That's trespassing. Just as I finished speaking, 2 squad cars pulled up to the curb. The officers got out, looked over at me, and then at Karen, who was already talking a mile a minute. Officer, Karen said, rushing toward them with exaggerated urgency. This man is blocking access to my property. I've been using that shortcut for years, and now he's harassing me. He's preventing me from getting home. The officers exchanged an uncomfortable glance before one of them approached Karen. Ma'am, we understand you're upset, but this isn't a public road. It's private property. Karen's face turned bright red, and I could see her trying to process the officer's words, like they were somehow an affront to her very existence. But I've used it for years. I've never had a problem with the old owners, and now this new guy shows up and puts up a sign, and I can't get through. One officer turned to me. Sir, is there a reason you've put up a sign on your property? Yes, I replied calmly. I'm the new homeowner, and I don't want anyone using my yard as a shortcut. I've asked Karen multiple times to stop. This isn't a public path, it's my land. The officer nodded, and then, to Karen's surprise, he addressed her directly. Ma'am, I understand this may be an inconvenience, but this is a private property issue. You'll have to find another route. You can't just cross someone's property without their consent. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but stopped short when the officer's words sank in. There was nothing more to say. The officers exchanged a few more words with Karen, who grumbled under her breath about how unreasonable I was. But in the end, they left her standing there, and the situation was finally resolved. Karen turned and stormed off toward her car, muttering the entire way. As the officers drove away, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. It was over, for now. But I knew it wouldn't be the last time I'd have to deal with Karen. She wasn't the type to let go of something easily, but I was ready. My land was mine, and I wasn't going to let anyone treat it like a public park again. Thank you for joining us on these stories of Karens who learned the hard way not to cross the wrong people. While some may never learn, the rest of us understand the cost of pushing too far. Stay tuned for more unforgettable moments, and remember, there's always more to the story than meets the eye.